So just a couple of housekeeping items. I see a lot of new names, so welcome to everybody who's new to this, and we're thrilled to have you. This is the 12th webinar that we've done, which excluding some that we've do exclusively for our clients, like Q&A formats that we do every couple of weeks. But this is the 12th open educational seminar. We've had great feedback. There's probably now, after this one, there'll probably be 20, almost 24 hours of video online in our YouTube channel. So for those of you that are joining for the first time, we record all of our sessions, even the closed Q&A sessions, and we upload that information so you could knock yourself out looking at those videos. They're very, very helpful. This is the part 4 of due diligence. There'll be one more part afterwards to cover the last 2 categories. And the reason why we broke this down into a number of parts is because obviously the due diligence part of the business acquisition is critically important. And 11 categories to cover, and in order to do it in a meaningful way, and in a way that everybody would be able to process the information, decided to break those down into sessions. So this is part 4, and I would urge you to go back and look at the other sections. In a minute, I'll take you through the 11 categories briefly, but it's really important because what happens during the subsequent sessions, we may refer back to something we talked about earlier. And so for you to be properly informed, you'll find it very helpful. Notwithstanding that, when we open up to the Q&A, please do not be afraid to ask any questions that may be related to something outside of this particular subject matter that we're covering today in due diligence, or any subject matter whatsoever. But again, want to emphasize how important it is to go back and look at the prior videos, because the videos are presented in a building block methodology, and that's the strategy to acquire a business in a good way, is to be able to do this in a logical progression. There's 23 steps in the business buying process, right? That goes from the beginning, things to consider about buying a business, personal considerations, straight through to post-purchase priorities, and 21 steps in between that. And so we format these in a building block, building block methodology, so that you learn about a category and then can move on to the next one, because it typically mirrors the various steps in the buying process. So we've talked about before why I do these free webinars. It's strictly educational. They're not an infomercial to sell you $10,000 products or anything of that nature. Yes, we do have a course that teaches people how to buy businesses. We've sold over 100,000 of them. It's a great program. I'm very proud of it. And a lot of the people that are on this call follow that program, which also includes ongoing free consulting. But this is done for an information standpoint. And the genesis of this is a lot of the forums that are out there related to business buyers. There's a lot of bad information and misinformation. And the world of business buying has become very, very murky, mostly with programs and claims of buying businesses in unrealistic terms of, zero down and buying businesses, throwing off hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and closing deals in 30 days. And, I was thinking about this recently and saying, it reminded me of this. I don't know if anybody is old. I don't think anybody on this call is as old as me, but there used to be this commercial, this British actor, and he worked for E.F. Hutton, which was a big stock brokerage, and he used to talk and used to say, E.F. Hutton, we make money the old-fashioned way. We earn it, right? And then I was thinking about, business buying. I buy businesses the old-fashioned way. I go through it step by step with a proven blueprint. There hasn't been much evolution in the world of business buying, and I've been doing this for 34 years. Yes, some terminology may be introduced. Sometimes there's different lending facilities or interest rates vary, but by and large, if I were to die and come back in 20 years, the process would be 90% the same. And that's why we always joke about our programs. If that were to happen and came back, I'd probably have to write 10 pages out of the 548. So this is a blue collar process. There's no shortcuts. This requires good education, good advice, and a good process. That's it. There's nothing fancy to this process, but at the same time, there's no shortcuts. And so hopefully everybody who's joined today will find the information very helpful. one of the things that, come to light is if you've never bought a business before, regardless of your background, your education, etc., if you've never bought a business before, the smartest thing you could do is recognize you know nothing about the process and go into this open-minded, because know what you don't know. And formalized education. We have a lot of clients that are, MBAs with from great institutions, but what they teach you in business school has nothing related to buying a business. And you like to use the term that, your education doesn't conjugate with the knowledge that you need to buy a business. So just be open-minded. I've bought 14 companies in my career, deal sizes from $50,000 to $208 million. I don't have a university degree. I can assure you that this is doable by anybody, as long as you follow a certain process to do this, where to make sure you buy a good business. My goal with all of our clients is to make sure you buy a good business at a great price and do it in 6 months. If you've been spending more than 4 months looking and haven't found a number of categories and have made at least 4 offers on businesses, then chances are you're becoming one of the group that fails in this process, and the numbers are not great. It's over 90% of the people who begin the search to buy a business never complete a transaction, and those numbers are going up. And it's really because a lack of knowledge and a lack of guidance to get through the process, because this is not a difficult process, but it is complex. And so if you don't do this in the proper way and follow the right steps and have the right knowledge behind you, you're just not going to get it done. When you take a combination of not having any experience or track record, etc., and the competition of other buyers that are out there, that's simply going to be the result, and there's no disputing the data. About today, we're going to cover investigating the suppliers and customers during your due diligence phase. Our section on due diligence in our course, How to Buy a Good Business at a Great Price, is 49 pages and a lot of summary reference sheets and ancillary documents related to that. So obviously I'm not going to cover 49 pages. I'm going to give you a real good overview and the high level points. Due diligence is also a real good lesson for everybody into how you want to run your business going forward, because what you're going to see in a lot of businesses, you're going to go in there, and whether it be the financials or their process, their systems, the metrics, their data, it's going to look like a big pile of spaghetti. It's going to be all over the place. And one of the things that you could learn from that, as long as you can figure it out, is you want to run your business differently. And make sure when you do acquire a business and take it over, some of those areas that are less than stellar or disorganized or not done in a good way to be able to extract good information on an ongoing basis, you want to make those corrections, because it's not only going to help you run your business better, but the time is going to come when you go to sell your business, you want to have those things in place. So learn from your due diligence all the things that people don't do well, so that you can do the opposite when you acquire your business and put those things into place. So as we say, let's get the patty started. You could crank it up. We'll have everybody on mute, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So we talked about this briefly, which is this concept of the 90% failure rate of people who begin the search to buy a business, don't complete a transaction. Those numbers are actually going up. It's actually about 94% now. And that 94% failure rate is often realized during the actual due diligence process. That's when this process acts like quicksand and gets a lot of buyers to abort the process. 50% of the deals in the lower market, and there's some different definitions for the lower market, but typically businesses under $10 million of EBITDA, and certainly the size. 50% of the businesses that where contracts or LOIs are agreed to fall apart during due diligence. The deals die. So very often what you want to do is you don't want to look for answers from people with the same problem. So when you're going through this process of buying a business and in due diligence, when questions come up or issues, one of the things, and what has become one of the biggest catalysts for me to do these educational webinars, is you have all these communities and business buyer networking groups and what have you, and everybody's in the same boat. They're all looking to acquire a business. So you have 5, 10, or 100 people, and everybody's got the same problem. And so when you're asking questions from people that are in the same boat, those aren't the people that you want to ask the question to, because they haven't solved the problem. Okay, these are all business buyers that have no track record, often no money, no experience, what have you. And so if asking your questions or how to navigate certain parts of the process with those same people. They don't offer you any value whatsoever because they haven't solved the problem. So you during the buying process, and especially during due diligence, you've got to ask your questions to people who have solved the problem, not the people that have the same problem. I'm a strong believer there's no such thing as dumb questions. There's only dumb answers. But as an offshoot to that, there's sometimes dumb strategies to who you're asking the questions to. So make sure during this entire process, and certainly during due diligence, as stuff comes up, get the answers from people that have solved the problem. Buyers screw up during deals during due diligence because part of this is misunderstanding your deal team. Your accountant and your lawyer's role are almost entirely during the formalized due diligence process, not throughout the process. And we're going to cover that in a minute, what the distinguishing factor between the two is. So you're going to bring your attorney and accountant in at certain parts during your due diligence, but they are not your mentors, your advisors throughout the process, because much of what you have to do on your own, and they're limited in their scope related to most of the steps during the business buying process. So the parts of the process that are entirely up to you, and again, we talked about your accountant and attorney playing a role at some point, of the various stages in the buying process, these are entirely up to you as a buyer to determining what business is right for you, mastering the find it stage. You'll never hear me talk about the search stage. I can't stand the word searchers. To me, that someone is just like an endless search for something. So I'm not going to talk about that anytime in a positive light. You're finders, you're not searchers, but mastering the finding it stage of finding the right business is up to you. Navigating broker gatekeepers, preparing for and conducting seller meetings and knowing the key questions to ask and the answers to look for, investigating the business, the industry, and the market before the formalized due diligence is critically important, because you have to get your start on due diligence very early. If not, you're not going to have enough time. Now, these things that we're referring to, when you go back and look at prior videos, we've had sessions on all of these. But again, these are all up to you, the buyer, not your accountant, not your attorney. Compiling your valuation, negotiating the deal, financing the purchase, and quarterbacking the formalized due diligence. If you don't have expertise in this area, either you've got to acquire it or you're going to have to take your chances. And one of the things that's come up a number of times during these sessions is the financing the purchase part, where I see this repeatedly on some of these forums where someone will say, I have an accepted LOI in place. Does anybody have any recommendations related to financing? If you get a formalized or an LOI in place and you don't have your financing, I'll bet dollars to donuts that you are not going to close that deal. You don't wait until you have an LOI in place to start getting your financing. These are all things that you have to do early on. And so for the inexperienced business buyer not realizing this, you have to understand how this process works. What needs to be investigated? There's 11 categories of that need to be investigated. Today, we're going to do customers and suppliers, and you can see here what we've done in parts 1, 2, and 3. And the next webinar, and the final one, will be related to employees and legal and corporate. But again, due diligence begins the second that a business becomes of interest to you, because you want to be able to investigate the industry, the competition, the market, get as much information as possible so that you don't go into due diligence having this unbelievable amount of work that you have to get done because you have a limited time to do it. Furthermore, you want your formalized due diligence period to be confirmatory, not exploratory. In other words, you want to be able to confirm what you've already learned. There may be certain pieces to it that are exploratory, two of which we'll cover today in more detail, that are sometimes a good part exploratory. But by and large, you want it to be confirmatory, meaning that you've learned enough about the business and the various components of the business so that when you go into the due diligence, you're confirming some of the things related to numbers. You're confirming the things that you've already learned by asking certain questions to the seller and investigating those answers and validating those answers. Because if you go into due diligence having to investigate these 11 parts of the due diligence process and you have 30 days to do it, I can assure you, you are not getting it done. And if you don't get it done, two things happen. One of two things happen. Either you abort the deal. And that's why 50% of them die in due diligence because you're uncertain, or people go ahead with the acquisition and make a stupid mistake. And so doing this in an organized manner and going in there again, confirmatory versus exploratory, and having a background of knowledge and information related to certain aspects of the business is critically important. One thing I want to bring up, which I just read about where an update yesterday, is the employees, which we'll cover next webinar. But there's a law passed on April 23rd, 2024, that you can't sign non-competes with employees anymore. And so oftentimes when you look at a business and you say, well, there's a couple of key employees and we'll discuss it in detail next week, but I wanted to make anybody aware in case you're involved in an acquisition right now. As a new owner, you cannot bind an employee by a non-compete. It's different for the owner. But if you're thinking of wrapping up an employee, if you're in the midst of anything now, just go back and read that law because you're not able to tie them up. The prior webinars are on our YouTube channel, and see if perhaps you can put that in the chat of what that URL is. And again, advise you to go look through this, to go look through them because you'll find it very helpful. So let's talk about suppliers and due diligence. The goal is to determine whether suppliers will sell to you and on what terms. So first of all, you got to let logic prevail. If there's no supplier concentration, means it's a type of business that has a bunch of different suppliers, and you're not concerned if one happens to disappear. Use logic. You don't have to get crazy with the investigation. The supplier part of due diligence is reduced or minimalized if you have this wide swath of suppliers. However, what you want to do to start off is you've got to review all the supplier agreements. And you may be astonished to find out that some businesses with lots of suppliers, or even some key ones, they have no agreements in place, and we'll address that in a minute. You want to review all the supplier agreements. You want to see if they have transfer clauses or assignment clauses within those. There's also what's known as a change of control clause. Oftentimes, the supplier or these vendor agreements that you'll have with various suppliers may not have a transfer clause and an assignment clause, but have a change in control clause, which states that if the majority of the business is sold, the contract is null and void, or the contract is subject to renegotiation. Okay. Are the agreements with the owner personally, or are they with the entity? Very important. Because if they're with the entity and you need those contracts, and you may potentially have to do a stock sale versus an asset sale to transfer those agreements. So the takeaway here is get the agreements, read them, and understand them. And I can assure you that you can probably understand 95% of these agreements. If you have to get your lawyer involved potentially, that's fine. But for the most part, you'll be able to understand them. They're pretty straightforward. There could be performance clauses in the agreement, and which means that the business has to generate or purchase X amount of product from that vendor in order to trigger the renewal of the agreement. And so what you need to do in those cases, when those clauses exist, you need to understand, where does the business stand with its performance clause and that particular vendor at the point in time that you're looking to acquire the business. Because if you don't pay attention to that, you may find out that you bought the business and it didn't hit its performance clause, and then you lose the vendor contract. You want to understand the seller relationship with the supplier. Is it personal, or is it so personal that after the sale, the vendor is not willing to renew it? And you see that frequently. They've got a long-standing relationship, and for a number of reasons, some of which we'll touch upon in a minute, they're just not going to renew the contract. Are there, and it's pretty common. For example, one of my first businesses, I was in the manufacturer rep business, and we used to rep various lines in Canada, a pretty significant business. And when I went to sell that business, a number of my suppliers said, look, we're not giving this line to the next person. We gave you this line because you, which was me, because you had these connections with retailers and the end user. And so our contract is with you. It's not, even though it is with your business, we're betting on you. So, if you sell this to someone, we're not going to just give them the line. We're going to explore to see what else is out there as far as other people that could take over the line. So that's understanding that relationship, because sometimes it is so personal, it's just not going to roll over. One of the prior webinars, we talked about one of these, a client of ours that had, there was one huge vendor, represented 90% of the business. And the seller was of the ilk that's not a problem, that it's going to roll over. And we were pressing the seller to make sure we wanted to meet with that supplier early on in due diligence. They put up a big fuss. We were really adamant about it because it was so important. And when in fact, when we did call the manufacturer and spoke to the head person there, without going into details, they said to my client, I would urge you to consider buying a different business. How was that? And what happened was they had made a promise to another distributor in the region that if this individuals who owned the business sold their company, they would give the line to that other company. They were a monster in the industry, and said they will give them the line. So this is that's why it's so important to investigate whether or not it's going to roll over to a new owner. As far as understanding the seller's sensitivity with all of this, and I grouped this webinar into suppliers and customers because there's similar situations with both. They really bleed into one another as to what to look for. But, be empathetic towards the seller. They may be worried about word getting out, not only to the supplier, but to the industry. And they may be very concerned about you investigating. So we're going to talk about how to do that, but be empathetic. Don't be like a bull in a china shop. Tell you how to do that in a really good way. You want to confirm if the seller has spoken with the supplier already and made them aware, and if there are any concerns. Employee, customer, and supplier interface often is the final contingencies of the due diligence, meaning, and we'll talk about in a second, the actual conversation with these groups becomes a contingency to your contract. In other words, you list out the contingencies that the lease has to transfer and a verification of the numbers, but oftentimes you have to add in here, depending on the scenario, that speaking with the employees, speaking with the suppliers, and speaking with certain customers, if they represent, a significant part of the business, that you have to speak with those individuals. So oftentimes you have to articulate that you need to talk to these parties as part of your contract. It's not just this global due diligence clause that says you're going to do the investigation. Where warranted, you need to specify certain things like this, that you are going to have to talk to those people. So you don't just put in a blanket LOI without these contingencies if they're needed. If there's any concentration of suppliers, meaning a certain supplier represents a disproportionate amount of the business, you cannot defer that contingency to the end of your due diligence. So you have a supplier is 80% of the business. You're not going to go, you don't want to go through all of your due diligence, verifying, the financials, the market, the sales, the processes, et cetera, the 11 categories that we talked about, and only wait till the supplier till the end, because they can change the whole dynamic. So you don't want to waste your time and money. The due diligence rule is you do the big stuff first in due diligence. Big, important stuff, things that can change the landscape, change the deal, make you want to back out of the deal. Those big items, which could be supplier concentration and having to speak with the supplier and confirming that they'll continue supplying you, that's a big item. And so you want to do that at the very beginning, because you don't want to waste time. You don't want to waste money. You'll have your accountant and your attorney involved at this point. The clock is ticking. Their bills are going up. So the big stuff in due diligence, that's the golden rule. You do the big stuff first. You want to find out fast. Here's the steps. First, determine the importance of each vendor and the potential exposure or ease of replacement. You may have some concentration, but you can easily find another supplier potentially, so that mitigates that situation. You want to identify supplier contribution. How much of the business is attributable to them, which is another fancy way of talking about any concentration. You want to confirm with the seller the status and their general sense about the vendor and a transfer. You want to review the agreements, which we talked about earlier, and you may be shocked to find out that you're going to come across a business or many businesses where there's absolutely no agreements in place with any vendors. And oftentimes those agreements are not worth much because they can cancel in 30 days, but don't be surprised if you come across those, and it's not necessarily a red flag, but very often there's no agreements in place. You want to log your questions that you need to run by the by the supplier or related to the contract that you may want to validate with your attorney. You want to arrange to speak or meet with those suppliers. I prefer in-person meetings. I'm old school. I like a meeting, not even in Zoom. If someone represents enough of the business and I'm getting down the road and pretty serious, I want to park myself in front of that vendor. And I don't need to speak to the territory rep or the area manager. I want to speak to someone higher up in the company. Because if you speak to the territory rep, they'll tell you that's no problem, but they're not the ones who sign the agreements. So understand who you're dealing with. You want to make sure you're speaking with the decision maker. A phone call may in fact be adequate if they're just confirming there's no changes. And here's the thing, if the agreements are going to stay in place, whether status quo of the agreements, they're going to transfer, or whether there may be some new terms, what have you, get everything in writing. And if the supplier puts up a little bit of a fuss about a contract in writing, even though the contracts potentially can be terminated in 30 days, just blame it on the lender. Just say, look, my lender or my investor needs those contracts. So if they put up any fuss, that's your perfect out, your perfect way. You can blame it. You can blame it on someone else. So these are how you want to walk through it. So here's a couple things. What if a supplier won't continue the relationship? Well, can they be replaced? How easily and at what cost? Unless it's something that's uber exclusive, you may have to find a second source of supply. You want to, determine the risk with implementing this post-sale. And can you really know? I mean, it's very easy on the outside to say, yeah, we'll find a second source of supply and we'll be okay. But that's easy from the outside. Pay attention to that. Don't just draw your own conclusion without any data to make sure that it is possible. At what cost? Is it the same product, similar product? Is it adequate, etc.? Unlike a customer or revenue-driven performance, for example, if you have some customer concentration and you have a performance clause in with the seller, understand that a supplier is a different animal. If you don't have supply, you don't have revenue. So you don't have to worry about the customers. So this is really, don't underestimate the importance of the suppliers in the business, because they turn off the tap, you're out of business, potentially. You want to carve out your supplier revenues and profits from the P&L. And again, we're talking about when supplier, there's an element of concentration or a disproportionate amount from one supplier. You could do two separate P&Ls. And you do that also when we talked about previously with earnouts. Look at the business without that supplier. What does that business look like? Is it still profitable? When you look at these things and you have these conversations potentially with the seller and you look at the financial, whatever, don't believe the seller. The seller may tell you that, you're going to get they're going to renew, or you could easily replace them, or all these wonderful things. It's great to hear what they have to say, but you validate everything that they tell you. You trust but validate. And again, when you look at this and you want to try to determine a valuation of the business without this supplier, what happens? So then you get some really good context and perspective. If there are alternate sources of supply that are needed post-sale, and you have a performance clause in place, so you have this customer concentration, and you put a performance clause in place based on that supplier, and the supplier either won't continue or you have to get another source of supply, there should be a reduction in the purchase price. And the performance clause, if you have to go get another supplier, the seller shouldn't benefit from that, because they're selling you a going concern business. And when we get to the end of this section, if anybody is unclear about this, well, please raise it as a question. They're selling you a going concern business at a certain price and multiple based on the assumption that everything is going to remain status quo the day after you purchase the business, meaning the business you get on Tuesday is the same business they were running on Monday. If you have to replace suppliers, okay, that's no longer the same business. So if there's any type of performance clause in place related to vendors and you have to move away from those vendors, the seller should not get the benefit of that, because that's not a going concern business. And I hope everybody is very clear, but if not, please bring it up in the Q&A that you'll have in a minute. Again, we're talking about the importance of them selling status quo businesses. A few things to consider and do. Do you want to buy a business with supplier concentration, even if the agreements will continue? Think about that. That's important because one of the main goals of buying a business is you control your own destiny. So if you're beholden to one supplier, you need to consider that. I'm not suggesting for a second that you don't do it. I'm saying investigate it and also consider, as long as that you are comfortable with that. Can you obtain a secondary source of supply post sale? In every business that I've owned, I've always made sure that I have an alternate source of supply. And if it was a product that was exclusive or what have you, then I just wanted to have a longer, a more robust relationship and contractually with the vendor. And I was less concerned because no one else could get the product elsewhere either. But it's always good to have a second source of supply in your business. So think about that. You want to consider what life looks like when you want to sell. What happens if the supplier goes out of business? Here we are looking at the supplier, going to continue to sell us on what terms and pricing and everything is great. Well, you want to investigate the supplier's financial strength as well, because what if they go out of business? Investigate the vendor online. You could look at industry associations. You could get some Dun& Bradstreet reports, other things. I mean, you may not be able to get 100% clarity on their financial work, but you also have situations where you have a contract in place with vendor A. Vendor A sells their business to someone else. And the company that takes it over has its own distribution network in place, and then you're out of business. And so these are all things very important to consider. And there's also a thing related to year-end rebates. Oftentimes, suppliers will have rebate programs in place with the company that you're looking to acquire or with their distributors. And so those rebates, while they may be paid at the end of the year, you're going to have to do a pro rata adjustment because the seller has earned part of that. So you buy the business in August, for example. Well, anything that was rebatable as far as money going back to credits to the owner, they deserve the first 8 months of the year of that, or the January to August period. So understand that can come up. The negotiation should be very, very simple, which is they're entitled to that. It's like when you buy a house and the taxes that are paid in arrears, then you do the adjustment accordingly to the closing statement. And for materials that you need to investigate the suppliers, pretty simple stuff. Purchases by vendor, on-hand inventory by vendor. So you understand. And in the course, for those of you who aren't aware, our due diligence section breaks down the 11 categories into everything you need to do, how you proceed to go about it, and the materials that you need for each one of the 11 categories. Before we get on to customers, let's just open it up briefly for Q&A. If there's anything related to suppliers that people are unsure of or you want to bring up, feel free to do the hand raise and we can address any questions. If not, we'll move on. I think we got Gabe.
Yeah, can we use the suppliers to help fund our deal? Say if we make a deal where we keep saying we keep buying from them, can they help maybe put in money?
Yes. And I don't know if you read the section on financing the purchase yet in the course, but that's one of the things that we allude to. Yes. It's always worth having that question. When it comes to financing the deal, I've gone to my attorneys and accountants and asked them if they wanted to participate, because often they don't even get those opportunities. So yes, the flip side and the danger is you don't want your suppliers to look at you and say, oh my goodness, they don't even have the financial strength to complete this deal. So it's delicate. You don't want to ask that in your first conversation with them. Maybe you get to know them a little better. You start talking about it. And it's something that could come up. You just want to tread lightly, but it's definitely a viable option. It's a great question. And the answer is yes, but just do it in a good way.
Question to start.
I think Torrance has a question, but I didn't hear you so far.
Can you hear me a little bit, Richard?
Not really.
Do
you want to put it in the chat and see how read it?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Really low. Try. Go ahead. Ask the question and see if maybe you could repeat it.
Okay. My question is, I put it in chat. I'll wait a few minutes. I don't think you can hear me.
Okay, that's fine. We'll put it into the chat. Anybody else? No? Good to go? Oh, Bridget has a question. Yeah.
Just a fast a lot of these things, right? They're delicate. You're trying to go through the seller. I've submitted a full list of required documents and such like that. Is this all just in your touch points with the seller to say, hey, can you get me in contact with this such and such supplier? Or how do you continue to use the seller, but delicately through the early weeks of the process?
Well, the thing is related to seller, for example, as we talked about earlier, you want to make sure, how important is it for you to speak to the supplier and when? Obviously, big source of supply, we talked about, you want to move that up and that becomes a big item. You want to do that early. It should be as no surprise. I don't think there's an element of being delicate. It's just, hey, I've got to speak to the supplier. Have you, confirming, have you spoken? Before you even get to due diligence, you should have already asked the question as we lay out in the course to ask them, have they spoken to these suppliers? Are people aware? If they aren't, just ask the seller, say, we've got to speak to the supplier. It's really important. How do you want to set this up? Do you want to have a call? Do you want to put me in contact? Do you want to have a call? Do you want to be on the call? Right? I mean, you don't want to get the seller panic stricken or anything of that nature. I've never had a problem at asking the seller if the seller wants to even sit on the call. I'm completely transparent. So I don't think I know you're a very kind guy. I don't think there's really any tiptoeing. I think it's, here's my due diligence. Here's what I got to do. I got to speak to the vendors. How do you want to best go about doing this? Straightforward.
Right.
Okay, Torrance, now we see you live and in person. So I'm assuming your mic works better. Good to see you. You're on mute.
Okay. Hey, so I was going through that deal that we were talking about, and one of the things I was looking at, would it be better if you have the original seller? One of the things that I was looking at, but I didn't go through some seminar. One of the things I was looking at, could you have the seller stay on board while you update the contracts and they still represent the company? So, say for example, it's a contract which they had with Department of Corrections. My plan was to have the seller on board because he was willing to stay on as a consultant. And so I was going to just utilize him over the next few months as the face of the contract until we get the contract signed. And then by the time, we reach the next contract, I'll be fully capable of managing the contract. Is that a good plan, or would you want to
hopefully I heard your question because it was very garbled, but to repeat it and just give me the thumbs up does it make sense to keep the seller on board in some type of capacity, potentially as a consultant post sale while you negotiate these agreements with the vendor? Is that the essence of what you asked?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. My wife keeps telling me I don't hear very well. She doesn't understand that I'm not paying attention, but now I need something I hear okay.
It's my headphones. I was switching out headsets.
Look at you. Now you sound perfect. Okay.
See, there you go.
There you go. Okay. So the answer to this is the following. I'll give you the answer is no. And the reason why the answer is no is you want to get those contracts resolved before you buy the business.
Okay.
Because there's no guarantee. I mean, the seller can stay. What happens if they don't renew? So you're in trouble. You don't have a source of supply. So the important thing is to go about this where it makes sense to do this. At what point you do this during the due diligence, but you definitely do not want to defer this post sale, because what if those contracts will not be renewed? Then you've not only lost those contracts, you've also paid the seller during that period. These are the things that you got to resolve during due diligence. Now, if you have one or two tiny suppliers that represent a small percentage, but you still need them, I mean, could you potentially do that we talked about? Yes, but that would be a rare exception. You got to get all this stuff settled before you close the deal.
Even if the contracts are like a year, because the one we had, their biggest contract was with DLC, it was a year and a half out. So you would bring that back in.
Well, legally, it might not even transfer to you, because if the contract is with the entity, so you've bought ABC Corporation, but you bought the assets of it, and you set up Torrance Patent LLC doing business as ABC Corporation, so you can continue doing it under the same brand. But the vendor has their contract with ABC Corporation, so that contract wouldn't even transfer to you, right? You got that? Make sense? Okay, and so you have to now. Early on, we talked about there may be assignment clause, there may be transfer clauses. So you have to look at those. Now, if there's no hesitation by the vendor to continue that relationship, then they should have no problem whatsoever transferring those agreements. But you want to make sure that you own those agreements.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you, sir.
And it's a great, by the way, it's a great question, because I see it all the time where someone will come to me, as part of our consulting and say, the thing I like about this business is, their contract just renewed with this company and they've got sort of guaranteed revenue over the course of next year. I said, well, no, fasten your seatbelt. There's no guarantee of revenue. It's actually just the opposite. It could all end on day one. So you got to get that into your entity.
Sort of like those FedEx routes where people buy those routes and lose the whole business.
Yeah. Yeah. I like those businesses, by the way. Well, not when you lose them, obviously. Yeah, I looked at a bunch of them. Yeah, I mean, they were pretty interesting model. I don't know if it's changed quite a bit, but it was an interesting model. There was a lot of those where either FedEx, their customer, they lost the deal with their contracts. Certain customers that they were dealing with as the end user. So yeah, it's a perfect example. Okay, for customers and due diligence, this is the single biggest seller concern, and as it should be. And in many cases, it should also be your biggest concern. Okay. Employees, suppliers, and competitors, and all those other pieces to due diligence and financials and the marketing, etc. Those are all a distant second. This is the $1 million question. Why? Because financials are math. You can figure those out in a nanosecond very quickly. Then you want to know, are the customers still going to buy from you? That's the big question. If you think the sellers are worried about you talking to suppliers and you ask them to speak to customers, you're going to put them into therapy. Okay. They get like panic stricken at this thought, but it's appropriate. And oftentimes it's something that has to be done. So you want to be mindful of their situation, because they're as concerned if word gets out that they'll be in trouble. At the same time, you got to be firm. You may have to have those conversations. Now, if you're doing a business where there's no real impact related to the customers, to give you an example, my business, my publishing business, we sell our product to consumers online. People come, we have this ongoing consulting that we provide part of the program. But if someone was looking to acquire the business, they don't need to speak to you guys. They don't need to speak to our customers, because the orders, they come in, we have articles, they generate leads to our website, people place orders for the course. There's no real, there's certainly no concentration, but there's no material impact related to our customers. You compare and contrast that if we were selling a product to Walmart, for example, and Walmart was our biggest customer. Well, we need to speak, you as the buyer want to speak to the Walmart buyer. So understand, in some cases, it's not even necessary. In other cases, it's critically important. But if you need to speak to the customers, again, you be mindful of their concerns, but you've got to be firm. What you don't want to hear from the seller is whether it relates to employees, whether it relates to customers, whether it relates to suppliers. If they say to you, if word gets out, my business is done. Because what that generally indicates is that the owner is the business, that the employees, the customers, suppliers, everybody perceives the owner as the business. So you got to be very careful. If you hear that, you really need to pay attention. Like suppliers, use logic to determine the depth and breadth of your organization. Sometimes it's usually never in the middle. It's usually either critical or it's minimalized. You don't want to over or under index this part of due diligence, something I just referred to. Make sure you understand and look at this logically as to what is the level of detail that you need to go into the analysis of the due diligence. Let me just do something here, because my sheet just got a little much smaller, but I think I could, let me just see something here. There we go. Apologize for that. Some businesses don't matter. Retail businesses, supply businesses, parts businesses, some distribution business, some home service businesses. If they're not seller centric, meaning it's not, Osvaldo's HVAC company or Chris's pest services. If there's nothing attached to the owner, or the owner isn't intimately involved with the interaction with every single customer, and certainly some retail businesses, the investigation of the customers is drastically minimalized, right? If there's any concentration of customers, we want to talk about how to define it, then the client meetings move up on the contingency removal timeline. Remember, I said you go into this, you attack the big things first. If there's customer concentration, looking at a business right now, there's 40% of the business is done with one customer. Phenomenal business, highly profitable. 40% of the business is done with one customer. And we are working out right now a performance-based deal so that if the customer doesn't continue, then the valuation changes dramatically. In that case, I've got to meet with the customer. 40% concentration, really important. Other times, you have 6, 8, 10%, less important, but you also want to look at the percentage of the gross margin. Sometimes you have a customer that may only represent 15% of the business, but they're being sold at a very high price, or every project done for them is immensely profitable. So they may be contributing more to the gross profit of the business, commensurate or more than their percentage of the overall revenues are. And hopefully that's very clear to somebody. So you really need to dig into the data points related to this. The way I look at and define customer concentration is I carve out, and there's no hard rules to say, well, a customer concentrate anybody more than 20% or more than 10. You have to look at everything in each business individually. The way I look at it is I take the valuation. I say, if the business from that customer disappears, am I still interested in this business? Because sometimes, it's still profitable. It's just not at the level you want it to be. And so if you lose that customer, what happens? Do you think you'd still want to buy this business? If the answer is no, you end the deal. That's it. If you don't have, because even if you have a performance clause, you still say to yourself, well, now the earnings drop from, seller's discretionary earnings will drop from $1.2 million to 750. I don't want to do it. Either whether it's servicing the debt or I want a bigger business, whatever. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense for you to do it. I'll also give you an example of customer concentration that came across in a very bizarre way. This was one of our clients who have our program, and we were talking with the seller. And one of the things they mentioned, this was it was a business services, and they expressed to me that they have 20 customers, and none of them represent more than a few percent of the business. I think one was 7, one was 2, etc. And great. And during the conversation, they said to me, yeah, and of the 15 customers, what are some of part of a larger organization? And I said, whoa, stop for a second. What do you mean part of a larger organization? They said, yeah, well, these are 15 customers, but they're all owned by this multinational company. They have, probably 30 different divisions. 15 of those divisions buy from this company. But the seller told me, don't worry about it. They're all treated differently. So wait, no. Put on your brakes. That's customer concentration. That theoretically could be looked at as one customer. Said, no. They all have individual purchasing agents. They bill them, invoice them separately. They pay separately. And they were making the case to me like why this wasn't concentration. I said, well, stop for a second. Imagine, you have these 15 customers. They're all part of a global entity. Imagine if you really screw up one of the 15. You want to know something? All they're going to do is send an inter-office email to everybody, and then you're out of business. They're all going to stop buying from you. So customer concentration can come in different forms. Just because they have these entities that are somewhat autonomous, they're still part of one organization. So in fact, when you're doing your due diligence, that's one customer. That's customer concentration. So that's why you ask the seller, you get the answers, and you validate. Okay. Then we, in an earnout formula, same thing here. We've talked about it ad nauseum before, which is if there's customer concentration, you do your valuation for the whole business, and then you carve out the business without that one particular customer. So you've determined that the whole business, example, is worth $2 million. And if you lose that one big customer, the valuation is $1.2 million. That delta of $800,000, that's your earnout. So you pay 1.2 for the business. The seller has the opportunity to earn $800,000 based on the continuity of the business. And again, we'll have the Q&A right after. If anybody is unclear, just bring it up as a question. If the sellers, let's carry on. concentration we talked about could be an aggregate account, and if it's an important part of due diligence, there is some concentration, but it's not critical. You may have to sign off on other parts of due diligence first and then just get to that, because again, the seller doesn't necessarily want you to have those conversations with their customers until until they know, for example, that you've agreed to the you've signed off on the financial due diligence. If the sellers are not willing to let you have access, then clearly they're begging for an earnout. And understand that the sellers cannot guarantee that the customers will still buy from you. If you mess up the business, that's not the seller's fault. Let's talk about the big three questions you must answer in due diligence. And buyers who don't answer these three almost always make massive mistakes. Number one is, why do the customers buy from the company? That you need to determine. And if you cannot define why the customers buy from the company, I strongly suggest you don't buy the company. Will they still buy from you, and why? And why won't they buy from you, and why? And I've seen it repeatedly on the sell side. Buyers don't spend enough time on customer due diligence. Okay. And you do that at your own peril. This is critical. We talked about that. If you want to go back and reference the section on due diligence as far as sales and marketing, we talk about this more extensively. But let's go on and talk about how do you determine the answers? Why do customers buy from the customers? I read this one book. I don't know if you guys have ever read it. It's called Swim with the Sharks Without Being Eaten Alive. It's written by Harvey Mackay. It's probably 30-year-old book. It's a great book about running a business. He ran a company called Mackay Envelope in Minneapolis. Great book. But he talked about this one thing where he said, you find out what customers buy for you. It's price, quality, or service. Pick any two. Because it could never be all three. One offsets the other when you think about it, right? So why do they buy from the company? You want to pick any two. Sia, could you jump to the next slide, please? Understanding the relationships. Look out for bidding businesses. By bidding businesses, government contracts, anything requests for quote businesses, requests for quote businesses with repeat business, anything related to the government, procurement officers, etc. Anything that could be considered a bidding business, because very often it's the relationship with the seller. They might even get informed about some projects that no one else even knows about. So when there's a bidding business, understand the relationship. If it's their brother-in-law, Bob, who's the procurement officer, well, you're not going to be in the same position when you go to bid on the business. Sometimes there's no choice. You may find a business that, it's got an exclusive product or territory or, distribution system or any component to the business where customers really don't have a choice, or it's convenience. And sometimes that's the reason. And then related to the customers is and why do they buy from the company? You want to ask yourself, what has to happen for these relationships to continue? Now we're going to go on to what will they still buy from you and why? So, for example, these are typical buyer concerns. It's normal. So you want to learn and what is your exposure to some of these customers? Sometimes they don't have a choice. Sticky businesses. Why do the customers buy? Storage businesses, software businesses where there's too much pain to buy from someone else. Like, people do more to avoid pain than they do to seek pleasure. So sometimes they just keep buying because it's easier. But in software business, or you have a program where it's a subscription type business, it's just too much of a pain in the rear end for people to change. So those are what I consider sticky businesses. How easily can they move their businesses? And very often they don't care if the business is sold. There's no meaningful relationship with the owner. So that's okay too. Determine how often, some of these things you want to determine. How often the seller interacts with the clients. Does the seller have their own clients? Is the seller the face of the business? These are really, really important. And as smart and as nice as everybody is on this call, don't blow up your own tires. Some of these customers just may not buy because the owner has changed. And be aware of it. If there's any personal relationships between the seller and customers that are more than the business, this is a common issue again in bidding businesses. Okay, now we'll go into the third part, which is why won't they buy from you? Again, it's either the seller's personal relationship or you screw up the business. That's pretty much it. And you screw up the business where it's certainly not the seller's fault. How do you meet the customers during due diligence and some other to-do items? I've done it in many cases where, I've posed as a sales trainee. They have a sales staff to go to meet the customers. I tagged along, shut my mouth and tagged along, then they're sales trainee. That's one real good way to do it. You absolutely want to get a sense of the sales interaction and the sales interaction and the seller's involvement. So that's why when you talk about this guise of a seller like as a sales trainee, and sometimes I've done it where, the sellers brought me along saying, we're thinking about opening up another office somewhere else. And this is the gentleman who's going to open up the office, and they've tagged along. You could always find a creative way to do it. And again, we keep in mind sensitivity towards the seller's concern, that you're not going in there as just the potential new owner. I've had this in situations where I've got it as a seller's trainee, bought the business, and then just went back and apologized to the customer after. Sorry to be misleading, but in respect to the seller, I didn't want them, no one wanted to disclose or buy the business, and everybody's cool about it. You said you could always apologize and explain later. One of the things that you may want to consider if the seller's very apprehensive about it is ask them if you can do a survey, an anonymous survey with their customers. You can engage a third-party term, a company or a platform. It's very inexpensive. Say, we want to formulate the following questions, 5 or 10 questions, and send them out to all your customers. It's not as good as sitting in front of them, but it can give you some perspective. Other considerations and materials needed. You want to understand the customer's financial strength. You may have a customer, whether concentration or not, but want to understand whether or not they're going into out of business. We had, which was it? One company that we were looking at, one of our clients, and Bed Bath & Beyond were one of their largest clients. And they were talking about it. Bed Bath & Beyond, huge client. They were very positive about it. We started doing a little investigation and realized Bed Bath & Beyond was teetering. They've since, for the most part, they're out of the bricks and mortar business. Now they're just online, but it changed the whole dynamic. So you want to understand your customer strengths. The reports that you're going to need are get sales by customer history and payment history. How soon post-sale do you tell the customers? Depends on the business. Some of them you don't tell. Some of them, it could be 6 months, some of them immediately. It's just a level of concern. Sometimes in businesses where the seller, is an integral part of the business, you need to keep them on board. You do it over time. But just, use your head as to what makes the most sense. Sometimes they don't even need to know. And just in certain types of businesses. So again, let logic prevail. Year-end or periodic allowance. This is the flip side of those vendor year-end rebates. You have customers, very prevalent when you're selling to retailers. They get year-end rebates, meaning you, as the new owner, the company itself gives rebates to the customer at the end of the year. Could be volume rebate allowances, advertising allowances, markdown allowances, marketing allowances, etc. Whereby, so for example, widget number 1, I sell this product to Walmart. And they buy X amount of them during the course of the year. And we have an agreement in place that says at the end of the year, you rebate back to us 2% of all purchases via a credit note that we apply to future purchases. Well, you got to be aware of that, because you're going to be stuck giving the rebate, and the seller got the benefit of the sales early on. Okay, so what does that look like? And so potentially you have to hold money in escrow to account for that. Now, when there are year-end rebates or marketing money, whatever it may be, it just year-end type of allowances, that'll be contracted. That's going to be contracted. It has to be. It's got to be memorialized somewhere in agreement between the company and the customer. Now we're going to talk about the Q&A and ask me anything. So we can open this up, and happy to answer any question, whether it be related to due diligence, these categories, or anything else. Okay, Mr. Britton.
Try to keep it as short as possible, but
no problem.
Confirmatory, where you come in to due diligence and something just kind of immediately starts to pop out on a financial standpoint. Something with it was essentially the broker did not do his due diligence on a lot of the cash and expenses and such. And so I'm wondering, do I need to put it back on the broker to say, hey, I'm seeing some funny things here. Some of the things aren't lining up. Can you please clarify this? Right? Play innocent and ignorant. Because it looks like it could be about a 40K difference on 2023.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with asking the broker first. We talk about broker. The broker serves three purposes: typically access to businesses for sale. They've done these deals before, so they know how to get the finish line. And the third one being, you want them to be a buffer between you and the seller. You're going to need a seller for post-sale training. And so if there's any difficult news, bad news, harsh news, it's always good to leverage the broker and let them let them deliver the bad news. And so the first thing you could do is ask them. And if that answer is not satisfactory to you, you go right to the seller. The quicker you can I know when I represent sellers, I'd like to get my buyers and sellers talking as quickly as possible because it helps the relationship. But yes, I would put it on the broker first. And if they can't answer it, and even if they answer it, like they give you the answer, that answer may not be satisfactory. Like that's their answer. And so if you give you the answer, say, no, we're going to need to scrub this a little further, and I'm going to need to speak to the seller about it, or I may need to speak to the seller's accountant about it. Like, you don't want to you could hear the answer for them, but you're not taking that as gospel, right? You've got to validate that.
Okay. That's good enough right now. Thank you.
And if it's not good enough, ask it again.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Gabe.
I guess my question is on validating information, especially on things that aren't as quantifiable, kind of like in a P&L statement. Like, I guess, why do customers buy? Is it because of the owner? How do you even see? Like, I guess you got to spend some time in the business, but is the way to see that maybe they really like the owner, or
yeah, it's a great question because buying a business is, it's art and science, and I like to make it as scientific as possible. But these are things that usually they will come out. That's why it's so important to have a good relationship with the seller, because in those conversations, oftentimes they disclose stuff to you that they normally wouldn't even disclose. So understanding why they buy is really digging into the product that's being sold, who are the customers, understanding that relationship, understanding who the competitors are. Is it because of the product? Is it because of the service? Is it because of the caliber of the individual? Is it because you just have a dynamite sales team or one terrific salesperson? And that's why, the answers are always there. The data always holds the answer, right? But in some cases, it's a little more altruistic. Like sometimes it's just convenience, and sometimes it's not a great answer. It's just they buy because it's convenient. But it's by allowing yourself enough time to do the due diligence and being able to go into these questions. And also speaking, one thing that, I found works quite well in certain cases is you can often go to a competitor of the business and ask them, just never disclose what you're looking at for the business for sale. You could tell them, I'm looking at a business, in 7 towns over in another state, and just trying to get yourself a handle on why do customers buy for you? Because oftentimes it's a similar type business. And so it is a process of elimination from a standpoint of asking. You might have to ask 1,000 questions to get a handle on it. And sometimes you're very disappointed because the answer is just pretty simple. It's convenient. Oh, we've been doing this way forever. Where you want to be careful is in businesses that are very competitive. Because I don't like buying business that compete on price, but if it's a real competitive type business, why are people buying? It's so important. The reason being you need to get that answer is because similarly, it's so easy for them to buy from someone else. And so understanding that is really important. And sometimes the answers come from the employees. Sometimes that survey works. And sometimes it's like a little bit of zigzagging to get to the answer, but you got to get to the answer.
Hey, Richard, can I add to that? Because I feel like my recent experience is just so relevant to Gabrielle's question. So one of the companies I was looking at, I was on the call yesterday with their broker and my broker. And it was pretty like darn evident that this guy that owns this company runs the town. It's like a little suburb of, a major metropolitan area. The number of times they refer to him as the mayor of this town and knows everybody in this town and has been here forever. And actually, he's my best friend. And I mean, it made it pretty clear. I was like, okay, and it was like a very interesting. I don't even know. We got to a point where I'm like, I don't think you guys are even interested in selling this business. It's just, I don't know. They're just like this aura of how amazing this person was that owned this business and how busy he is and the relationships he has with the clients and going out and like interacting with the clients. So I was like, okay, so sometimes it just comes right out and you
and it's a great point, because the reality in that scenario, you have zero guarantee of the business continuing. I mean, because if this guy, it sounds pretty impressive guy, but it's a small town. But it's like, if they're buying from him because he knows everybody and he has a reputation or whatever, and that's great. But the flip side could be is like, maybe he goes and no one has any reason to buy from the next owner.
Yeah.
It's good that you were able to, because it would have been very easy for someone to get sucked in to the sales pitch, because from their standpoint, it was like a sales pitch, right? Saying, oh, no, this business is great. Everybody knows him. Everybody knows the business. But it actually it's really a negative from a buyer's perspective. So good to cut through that. It's great.
Richard, question for you. One of the businesses I've been looking at, as you know, for the past 2 months or so, is aligned with the staffing agency recruiting business, which is some of my background. Well, we have a few others, but the one thing, and I'm glad I was on this call today. I was on vacation last week on the last webinar, but you really touched on it today. It's so difficult because when you're buying like a staffing agency, everything is contracts based, business to business. So if you don't have solid contracts in place, you're just buying, some recruiters and, just some computers and things. So that's the problem with this particular business, which is actually kind of making me not want to go that route. I'm starting to look back to service, home-based service because of that, because the due diligence to um, confirm these contracts and the legitimacy, the extension, it's just a lot of stress and risk. Because I've done it before and I know how you can, manipulate that. Not wasn't manipulated, but I know you can have a contract, but you know that it's ending, or that the business, you have an insight as the owner. And so the seller coming in is just really buying this bomb that's about to explode in his hand. So it's kind of like, it's just like, I don't know. It's really kind of bad taste.
No, it's a great observation. So there's a few ways to look at it, because I have a good degree of familiarity with this, which is on the one side, a lot of those type of businesses, those contracts renew as long as you don't screw them up. In other words, the supply, the people who issue the contract issue them to people and to companies that just make their life easier. It's like Excedrin. They just don't want headaches. They want to make sure that you take care of it and everything's easy. And so, oftentimes they do renew. If you don't screw it up, it's going to renew. Okay. But there's, as you pointed out, there's the complete opposite end, which is those contracts sometimes are subject to renewal every 2 or 3 years. If the procurement officer changes, if they have, internally, maybe they're part of a larger company or a government component to them, and they're required by their bylaws or by law to put it out to 3 or so different people to get the to bids and to renew. So when there's a high degree of possibility that the auto renew or the renewal is a challenge, I agree with you. I mean, those are the businesses that are really tough to consider purchasing, because in theory, you go back into business every 2 years or every year with every contract, and there's no, sustainability. I talked about this boss theory that I have, that I like bland businesses that are operationally sound, sustainable, and scalable. And the sustainability factor of those businesses becomes like a real unknown, and maybe an unknown that is so unknown that the risk is not worth it.
I agree. It's almost to the point where if you're going to go in that route, you might as well do it yourself. At least you
That's
know
what
to face it.
exactly.
And the
Yes,
upfront cost is a lot cheaper.
yes, correct. Because you're not because in those businesses they really don't have if you can't predict the renewal of the contract, the reality is there's no goodwill in the business.
Yeah. And another thing, since COVID, that market has really got flooded with a lot of young people saying, "Hey, one contract you can make, make $1 zillion." So a lot of big companies, it's harder to land new contracts. So even if you were to buy a business in the staffing arena, and I'm not mad at it, but if you were to buy it, it's hard, and you lose that contract. Unlike B2C, you can always find new customers. You can always find the neighbors and friends. But on B2B, it's hard to land those contracts nowadays. So
Yeah.
you could be, it's something that I just want to just take on, but let's get it
Yeah, no,
done.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think there's two sides of the ledger, but the one side where there's no guarantee of the renewal, and especially if they don't have anything exceptional that would trigger those renewals. If you're just like in the Me Too business, I mean, like what are you really buying?
Yeah.
You're buying the value of the contract till the end of the contract. And if that's worth, I don't know, $500,000 to the end of the contract, well, the only reason why you wouldn't buy but for $1 million. You want to buy for $250,000 so you could make money on the arbitrage. There's no goodwill related to that business.
Correct, correct. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. All right. Any other questions? Newcomers, any other questions? Nope. We're good to go. So what I want to tell you for our newcomers, I hope you will join us and go to richardparker.com. We've got tons of free articles, free reports. Our course, How to Buy a Good Business at a Great Price, is available there. There's a lot of people on the call that use it and I know enjoy it. We have free consulting as part of that. You'll see on richardparker.com where it shows the courses. There's our main program, How to Buy a Good Business at a Great Price, and then the Due Diligence Mastery program. You don't need to buy the Due Diligence program because it's part of our main course. So don't spend your money on that. Go to the YouTube playlist, and you'll see all of our prior webinars. Sia will have this posted. We'll probably have it posted. Usually it's about 3 to 4 days when this is uploaded, right? You're still good with that, Sia? Okay, and this will be the subject line will be due diligence part 4, whatever. But you could see all the prior ones is there as well. So I urge you to do that. As far as the next webinar date, that'll get announced. We send out a notification to everybody. We will have our Q&A session for our clients likely on the 27th. It may be the following week. But of course, anybody who follows our program, you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. You have my direct email address. And if you have any questions or if you need to jump on a call, please let me know. And I'm happy to do that. I think we talked about this the last time. If there are decks or sims that you want me to review, just give me a couple of days because I like to read those in detail. And the way I read a sim is I read the whole thing, then I go back and read it a second time. I don't make notes the first time. So it takes me a little bit of time to review a 50-page deck, but I like to do them diligently. And I think that's it. That's all. No other questions. I think Britton has his hand up. If Britton has a question, if not,
I'm looking in the material as we speak as well. But my lawyer is working on the asset purchase agreement, and I remember the deal I was a part of many years ago. That was, another major part of the, negotiations, and this will have a seller note and such. And so I'm wondering, how, do I need to be delicate on when do I push that across the table for them to review? Is it early drafts of here are the main contingencies or elements that I want to put in the asset purchase agreement, like the final documentation, or when's a good time for that? Does that question make sense?
well, what is it specifically that you're concerned about putting into the agreement?
I'm guessing some of the reps and warranties. I know in the
Oh,
and the seller note is I think I'm going to have some clawbacks on some of the cash elements we've talked about. So I know that will be a sensitive element, but from what I remember, my LOI to actual purchase agreement was a, full legal review, 2 weeks almost, was just reviewing all the wording from the lawyer. This is a different lawyer than I'm using now. I'm guessing my current lawyer will be a little bit less thorough.
Got it. Well, that's not a good thing. Less thorough is not good. But with that said, I'm just a firm believer in getting as much or everything on the table as early as possible. Okay. Because I don't want to spend time, effort, and money, going through the due diligence and then have to renegotiate seller note or clawbacks or whatever. What I would suggest, though, if you think it may be sensitive, and you will get a lot of pushback, and you feel that you want, maybe if you want to just review the financials first to make sure they make sense, and you want to go ahead and then have the conversation with the seller. I mean, that's a strategy that potentially could be used. I personally, again, I don't like to waste anybody's time, but I like to waste my time less. And so I just believe that if there, whatever big issues, my life is hands above the table. I just think it's much easier. You get all that stuff out of the way. Now, sometimes you're dealing with a seller who's a real pain and not disclosing information or getting you information, and it's dribs and drabs, and you have to go through certain parts of the due diligence, or they're making your life miserable. And so you have a little bit of a different tact. But again, overall, by and large, I just like to get as much out there as possible. Because why do you want to go through an LOI, spend money, go into due diligence, then you have an asset purchase agreement, then you got to negotiate the whole thing, and you might have a bunch of things that the seller would just absolutely not agree to? Like, cut to the chase. Just get these things resolved to the best of your ability, early on, and then you know where you stand. Again, that's just, everybody has their own ways. To me, it just works much better when everything is up front, no secrets, and here's what we're looking at. You can potentially put this in a way of saying to them, look, there's a part of this business that you represented that X amount of dollars come in this way, or you said that this happens, and we're not sure yet. So I just want you to be aware that we're going to go through our due diligence. If in fact we cannot validate that, we are going to have to include some sort of clawback. I mean, you can present it like that, but to not disclose it or not suggest it, personally, I'm thinking, if I'm a seller, if some of this stuff kept coming up after, I actually would get kind of pissed, to tell you the truth, if I was a seller. So this guy went into the LOI, they signed it up. Now all of a sudden, they keep changing the terms. So I know you're a very straightforward, honorable guy. And so I know that wouldn't be the case, but the seller's interpretation could be completely different. So that's why I just believe you get everything up front. And if it's not going to work, it's not going to work.
That's good. I wasn't trying to hold back, but I think it was
No, I know that.
sensitivity. I appreciate that, though. That's really good. Thank you.
That's why it's another point, Britton, of having you want to have a good relationship with the seller, if at all possible. Open conversation, where if there's an issue that comes up in due diligence, and I'll bet you there will be, I could guarantee you that there will be, you can just get on the phone or go sit in front of him and have a good conversation. It's not adversarial, right? You want to be, on the same page with them. You want to buy, they want to sell, you like and trust each other. You get through everything.
It's great.
And we're speaking next week, right? We have a call set up.
We do. More fun details.
That's good. We're working through this. All right. Well, kiddies, that's it. That's all from Business Acquisition Land. It's good to see everybody. You need anything, I'm always available. I enjoy it, and I thank you for your participation.